Amari was born with the legacy of royalty in his blood, but growing up in the small town Georgia, he's always felt torn between two worlds. His parents, who fought against all odds to be together, overcame countless struggles and made a life in America. But now it's Amari's turn to face his own journey. As the son of an African prince and an American mother, he's caught between his roots and the pressures of fitting in. But when the call of his father's village in Africa grows stronger, he faces the toughest decision of his life. Will he leave behind everything he knows to embrace his destiny? Join us as we dive into Amari's journey of identity, love, and self discovery. Amari stared into the mirror, feeling like he was looking at two different versions of himself. At 16, he was tall, with the same strong features as his father, Kofi. His dark skin and proud posture reflected his African heritage, but his eyes, the thoughtful, kind ones he got from his mother, Clara, were full of uncertainty. Life in small town Georgia wasn't easy for someone like him, caught between two worlds. His father always spoke about the Maasai village in Africa, where their family was royalty, and one day Amari would be expected to lead. But here in America, being a prince didn't mean anything. It was just a story his dad told. At school, Amari wasn't seen as a prince. He was seen as different. Some kids made fun of him because of his African heritage, asking if he lived in huts or rode lions. The teasing never seemed to stop, and it hurt every time. But no matter how much it stung, Amari forced himself to laugh along with them, even when he felt like crying. He didn't want to stand out, he wanted to fit in. But no matter what he did, he always felt like an outsider. His father's words about their family's legacy echoed in his mind, but here in Georgia, reality felt like a fairy tale. Luckily, Amari had Malik and Jadin, his two best friends, who had been with him since elementary school. Malik was loud and always knew how to make everyone laugh, even in the worst situations. He could break any tension with a joke, and that made things easier. Jaden was mischievous and loved to get them into trouble with his wild ideas, but he always had Amari and Malik's back. The three of them had been through everything together, and with them, Amari didn't feel so lonely. But there was one person who made Amari's heart race like no one else: Zola. Zola had been his friend since they were kids. They had grown up together, their families close. She was smart, kind, and beautiful, with caramel colored skin and deep brown eyes that seemed to sparkle whenever she laughed. She understood Amari in ways that no one else did. They had always been friends, but lately Amari found himself thinking about her more and more. His heart would pound whenever she was near, and his thoughts would drift to her when she wasn't. But the idea of telling her how he felt terrified him. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if it ruined their friendship? He wasn't sure if he could handle that. High school was a mix of good and bad for Amari. On the basketball court, he felt like he belonged. He was one of the best players on the team. And when he was out there, dribbling the ball and hearing the crowd cheer, everything else faded away. It was just him, the ball, and the game. For a little while, he could forget about feeling different. He could just be. But off the court, things weren't as simple. There weren't many African kids at his school, and that made him stand out in ways he didn't like. Some kids were curious about his heritage, asking him questions about what Africa was like, but others made fun of him. The teasing was relentless. One day, as Amari was walking to class, a group of kids started in on him. "You are from Africa, right?" One kid sneered. "Do you guys even have internet there?" Amari felt his stomach twist, anger bubbling up inside him. He hated how they made him feel like he didn't belong. Before he could respond, Malik jumped in, flashing his usual grin. "Yeah, his Wi-Fi is probably faster than your grandma's." The hallway filled with laughter, and the tension broke. Amari smiled, grateful for Malik's quick thinking, but the words still lingered. People didn't understand. They didn't get what it was like to grow up between two worlds, to feel like you didn't fit in anywhere. Being both African and African American was complicated. Amari often felt like he wasn't enough of either. Some of the black kids at school teased him for being too African, while others thought he wasn't black enough. It was a struggle, and no matter what he did, he felt like he couldn't win. On top of all that, there were his growing feelings for Zola. They had always been close, but lately everything felt different. Every conversation with her was charged with something unspoken. He wanted to tell her how he felt, but he was scared. What if she didn't like him back? What if it's messed everything up? One afternoon after basketball practice, Amari sat on the bleachers with Malik and Jaden. Malik, always quick to notice things, had caught on to Amari's distraction. "Man, you've got it bad," he teased. "Just tell her already." Amari sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple, Malik. She's my friend. If she didn't feel the same, it will mess everything up." Jaden, who was leaning back against the bench, smacked. "Look, you're already halfway to Africa with all this prince stuff," was one little confession. Amari rolled his eyes, but deep down he knew they were right. He couldn't keep hiding how he felt. He needed to tell Zola the truth, no matter how scared he was. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Between basketball games, school, and hanging out with his friends, Amari tried to keep himself busy. But every time he was around Zola, his feelings for her grew stronger, and it became harder and harder to keep them hidden. One evening, after a late basketball game, Amari and Zola were walking home together, like they always did. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with shades of purple and blue as the sun set. Zola was laughing about something funny that had happened in class, but Amari could barely focus. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his palms were sweating. This was it. He couldn't keep pretending anymore. "Zola," he said suddenly, interrupting her mid-sentence. His voice was shaky. She stopped walking and looked at him, her eyes full of curiosity. "What's up, Amari?" Amari took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "There's something I need to tell you. I've been holding it in for a long time, and I can't keep pretending anymore." Zola's expression softened, and for a moment the world around them seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them standing there on the quiet street, with only the sound of the wind rustling the trees. I I like you," Amari said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean more than like you. I've had feelings for you for a while now. For a moment, Zola didn't say anything, and Amari's heart dropped. Had he ruined everything? But then a slow smile spread across her face. You took your time, she said, her voice teasing but warm. I was wondering when you were going to say something. Amari blinked in surprise. Wait! You knew? Zola laughed softly and brushed her hand against his. Of course I knew. I've liked you too, Amari. I just didn't know if you felt the same. Relief washed over Amari like a wave, and suddenly everything felt right. He had been so scared to tell her the truth, but now that he had, it was like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. They walked the rest of the way home together, hand in hand, talking and laughing like they always had. But now there was something different. There was no more pretending. Even with Zola by his side, there was something else weighing on Amari's mind. One afternoon, Kofi sat him down to talk, and Amari knew it was serious. Amari, Kofi began, his deep voice filling the room. There is something you need to understand about where you come from. Amari listened closely as his father explained their family's royal lineage. He had always known that his family came from a Maasai village in Africa. But now Kofi was telling him about the responsibilities that came with that lineage. One day, Amari would be expected to take on the role of leader in their village. You come from a long line of kings, Kofi said, and one day you will need to return to the village and take your place. The weight of his father's words settled on Amari's shoulders. He had always known about the village, but now it felt real. His father was telling him that one day he would be the one leading the village, making decisions for the people. It was a heavy responsibility, and Amari wasn't sure if he was ready for it. How will I know when it's time? Amari asked quietly. Kofi smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. You will feel it in your heart when the time comes. You will know. Just a few months later, Amari's life took a turn he never expected. One evening, after a basketball game, he and his friends were walking home, laughing and joking. The night felt perfect, and they were just about to head back to their houses when they noticed the flashing lights of a police car behind them. Amari's heart sank. They weren't doing anything wrong, but the sight of those lights sent a wave of fear through him. The police car pulled up next to them, and two officers stepped out. What are you boys doing out here this late? One officer asked, his hand resting on his belt. We're just walking home from the game, Malik said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the officer wasn't satisfied. You got ID? He asked. Amari felt the tension rise. They hadn't done anything wrong, but it didn't matter. After a few minutes of back and forth, the officers decided to take them to the station for loitering. Amari had never been in trouble before, and now he found himself in the back of a police car, feeling completely helpless. At the station, they were questioned for hours. No charges were filed, but the experience left Amari shaking to his core. Being treated like a criminal simply for walking down the street made him feel small and powerless. His parents came to pick him up, and while Clara hugged him tightly, Kofi's face was filled with a quiet anger. This is the reality we face, Kofi said as they drove home, his voice calm but firm. This country sees us differently. You've got to be twice as strong, twice as smart just to survive. Amari barely spoke the rest of the night. The feeling of helplessness, the way the officers had treated him and his friends, left a deep scar. As he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his father's words echoed in his mind. Maybe Kofi was right. Maybe the answers he was looking for weren't here in America. Maybe it was time to go to Africa and understand the part of him that had always felt out of reach. The experience with the police left Amari shaking. Sitting in the back of that police car, being treated like a criminal despite doing nothing wrong, opened his eyes to the harsh reality his father had always warned him about. No matter how hard he tried to fit in, America would always see him as different. The feeling of helplessness from that night stayed with him, and Amari couldn't shake the thought that maybe his place wasn't here after all. In the days that followed, his mind kept drifting back to Africa, the village his father had told him about, and the legacy that awaited him there. The idea of going back, of learning about his heritage, and stepping into the role of a leader started to feel like something he needed, not just a duty he had to fulfill. The final push came during a Black History Month event at school. Amari stood in front of his classmates, speaking proudly about his African heritage, and for the first time he felt truly connected to the stories his father had told him. After the event, he knew what he had to do. That night, he sat down with his parents. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. I need to go to Africa, he said. I need to see the village and understand my roots. It's time for me to take my place. Clara smiled through her tears. We always knew this day would come, she said. Kofi nodded, pride shining in his eyes. You are ready to embrace who you are. But before anything else, Amari knew he needed to talk to Zola. Later that night, Amari met Zola under the stars at the usual spot by the old oak tree. The night was quiet, but Amari's thoughts were racing. He sat beside her, trying to find the right words. I've decided to go to Africa, he said, breaking the silence. To my father's village. It's time for me to take my place. Zola blinked, processing what he had said. Wow! Amari, that's a big decision. Are you leaving for good? Amari shook his head. I don't know how long I'll be gone, but I can't ignore it anymore. I need to understand who I am and where I come from. Zola was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled softly. I always knew you were destined for something great. Amara hesitated for a moment, then took her hand. Zola, I don't want to do this alone. I want you to come with me. Zola's eyes widened. You want me to go to Africa with you? Yeah, Amari said, his voice steady. You've always been there for me, and I can't imagine doing this without you. Zola smiled again, a mix of excitement and uncertainty on her face. Of course I'll go with you. We've been through everything together, and I'm not stopping now. With Zola by his side, Amari felt more confident about the journey ahead. In the days that followed, they packed and said goodbye to their friends. The thought of stepping into the unknown filled Amari with both excitement and nerves, but he knew this was a right choice. As the plane took off, Amari looked out the window, watching the ground disappear beneath them. Zola squeezed his hand, and for the first time he felt ready to embrace his future. The prince was going home. this time with the girl he loved by his side.